We continue with the book of Divrei Hayamim. We are currently, Shlomo just built the Beit HaMikdash and offered his prayers for the temple, for the Beit HaMikdash. And we continue today. We're going to go forward in history. Chapter 8. Vayihi miketz esrim shana asher bana Shlomo at Beit Adonai v'et Beito. At the end of 20 years during which Solomon constructed the house of the Lord and his palace, we pointed that out yesterday, much more description of his palace, his other building projects in the book of Melachim. Here, right, this is the Shlomo, this is the David who didn't sin with Bathsheba. This is the Shlomo who is we're not going to talk about his political context and his marrying of the daughter of Pharaoh and his, many of his other wives and things like that. It's much more about him as the builder of the temple, as a much more ideal leader. And so we'll mention that he built his house, built his palace, great, but we're not going to get into details of it. The ha'arim asher natan churam l'shlomo bana Shlomo otam vayoshev sham et bnei Yisrael. Shlomo also rebuilt the cities that Hiram had given to him and settled Israelites in them, is another thing that Shlomo builds here. These other cities, okay. Vayelech Shlomo Chamat Sova vayechazek aleh. Shlomo marched against Chamat Sova and overpowered it. We don't hear much about wars and victories, but here we see something. Vayiven et Tadmor b'midbar v'et kol arei hamiskanot asher bana b'Chamat. Shlomo as well, he built other cities, including here in Chamat, okay, which is the north, if I remember correctly. Vayiven et Beit Choron Elyon ve'Beit Choron Atachton arei Matzor Chomot Latayim V'riach. He also built the upper Beit Choron and the lower Beit Choron as fortified cities. V'et Baalat v'et kol arei hamiskanot asher hayu l'Shlomo v'et kol arei harecha v'et arei haparashim v'et kol cheshek Shlomo asher chashak livnot Yerushalayim u'vanon u'v'chol eretz Mem Shalto. There was also Baalat and all these other garrison towns and chariot towns and cavalry towns. Shlomo desired to build them in Jerusalem, in the Lebanon, and throughout the Torah territory that he ruled. So we have other building projects. Again, it doesn't get into great detail, but it's going to present and Shlomo as somebody who has these territories, who has a lot of cities, successful Bnei Yisrael. They have wealth. They have lots of cities. They're building lots of towns. It's a successful time for Bnei Yisrael, and so we're being told at least some of the building that goes on, less of the forced labor. We do have one phrase here which sort of connects him with Pharaoh, which is this term arei miskenot. Is a term that's used here for the sort of the fortified town. Back when Paro enslaves the Jews in the beginning of the book of Shemot, it says that they built arei miskenot leparo, which doesn't have to be generally just something that you were enslaved to do, but so there may be a slight echo of that. We talked about more of that in the book of Melachim, less of it certainly here. Let's continue in verse 7. Kol ha'am hanotar min hachiti v'amori v'aprizi v'achivi v'avusui asher lo Yisrael hema. So now we turn from the Jewish people to those who were left there. Yoshua came in, Bnei Yisrael conquered the land of Israel, but there were some people who were left from the local populations. At times that was not such a good thing. We know that the Israelites were very easy to be swayed into the worship of idolatry, so it didn't always work out so well. So we have all these people. We have some people who were there from the tribes who were there when Bnei Israel came in. Interestingly, Canaani is not mentioned here. We know that before it was called Israel, it was called the land of Canaan. Min b'neihem asher notru achareim be'eretz asher lo kilum b'nei Yisrael v'alam Shlomo lemas ad hayom hazeh. So what happens is the descendants of these people who were left afterwards in the land of Israel, that were not destroyed, they were not annihilated, Shlomo subjected them to forced labor, as still is the case. We compared this, of course, to the book of Melachim, where that mas, that same word, is not just for the foreign people, but is for Bnei Yisrael as well. And that's part of the comparison that we had, again, in Melachim, much more of the comparison to Shlomo with undertones of Pharaoh. Misim is what Pharaoh subjects Bnei Yisrael to. It says taxes here. It's more of a forced labor. I don't know that in contemporary times we think it's okay to give the non-Jewish population in Israel forced labor. Certainly at that time, it was much more okay, in vogue, to enslave the foreigners and give them some sort of forced labor. It's not slavery in terms of Kunta Kinte and blacks in America prior to 1865, but it still is obviously not a wonderful thing to do. And thus here, we're only told of the Gentile populations amongst the Jews who Shlomo causes to do that, and not Bnei Yisrael, and that's shown to us further stressed in verse 9. Bnei Yisrael asher lo natan Shlomo la'avadim limlachto ki hema anshe milchama v'sarei shlisha v'sarei richbo v'farashat. But the Israelites, none of whom Shlomo enslaved, they were not doing the back-breaking labor. They were soldiers and officers and commanders of his chariotry and cavalry. So they also had to do, we'll call it national service. They were not doing back-breaking labor. They were not the people we would call enslaved. Again, it's not the slavery of the South before 1865, but it was obviously much more degrading and much more difficult work. That was not done to Bnei Yisrael. So Shlomo here doesn't come out looking in contemporary cultures phenomenal, but certainly at the time of the Second Temple period, it is the local populations who are difficult, who are harmful, who are getting in the way of Bnei Yisrael and its destinies and desires. Those are the people who Shlomo sent out to do the backbreaking labor. His own people, he did not do that, and that should hopefully charge and challenge the Bnei Yisrael of the Second Temple period, come back about who they are, what they should be able to accomplish. Let's continue with verse 10. Now we'll tell you a little bit about Shlomo's bureaucracy, a little bit about his structure of government. We have 254 men over the people. It was a big project. Right? We needed a lot of people. There were a lot of workers, and so we're told as to how many workers he had in charge. Back in the book of Melachim, there were 550 of them. So here's one of the places where they're actually lesser than there are the first time around. Don't know if it was sort of a typo or something. And now we're told, V'yad bat paro ha'aleh Shlomo me'ir David labayit asher banala. And we're told something here. The first woman that Shlomo marries in the book of Melachim is Bat Paro, which again is part of that whole Shlomo sort of Paro echoes, again, the taxes, the enslavement, etc. in the book of Melachim. Here she's not mentioned in the beginning, she's mentioned in the end, but look at the difference. She is a wife of his, but it's not about how he goes and marries her and wants to become an emperor and have a big alliance with Egypt, the local, regional, I should say not just local, but regional power. But rather, he moves her from the house of David to a different house. Why? Because it's improper for her to live in the house that was the palace of King David, because the ark was there. The Aron of God, by this point in time when we're being told this, the Aron is no longer there. The Aron has been taken out, and of course, moved to the Beit HaMikdash, but that's something that Shlomo did earlier. So it's casting the fact that he was married to the daughter of Paro into a very different light. It's not him as sort of somebody who wants to have an allegiance, somebody who maybe has echoes of the sort of the Pharaoh in him, but rather it's showing he happened to have this wife who was the daughter of Pharaoh. That's what was done for allegiances and alliances and to keep the kingdom strong. But he has a separation between her and his religious personality. He moves her away from the palace. And by the way, let me just tell you something which we learned about a long, long time ago. Generally, in the Tanakh, we have the narrative is told to us with the word Vav. Vayomer, Vayelech, Vayisa. Later on in this chapter, we have in, let's say in verse 14, we have Vayamed Kamishpat, and in verse 16, Vatikon. This happened and that happened and this happened. At times, we move away from that into a different type of grammatical setting, which is what we have here in the beginning of verse 11. The general grammatical setting of the first four words should be Vaya'al Shlomo et bat Paro is what it should say. The fourth word in that verse, he'elez, the verb, in the Hebrew general structure of the Tanakh, we talked about this a long time ago, we usually start with the verb. Right? When it changes, what it does is it's saying it's in the past perfect. So this is not saying, and then Shlomo moved the daughter of Pharaoh from the house of David to a different house and built her a different house because she shouldn't be in the house together with the ark. The change in grammar, right, if you're following with me, is saying this already had happened. It's the past perfect. It's something that Shlomo did a long time ago, but we didn't tell it in the story then because we went straight into, right, if we think of the way this book is structured, David gets everything ready for the temple, Shlomo builds the temple. And now we're just telling other things about Shlomo's life years later. So even though this happened many years earlier, we're being told now, so it's in the past perfect. Shlomo had built a house for the daughter of Pharaoh besides the house of David, but he didn't do it because she was an idolater and she wanted to have her idols. He didn't do it because for reasons of that. Why had he done it? He did it because he wanted to make a separation between her and the ark, the Aron of God. If you get that. Everybody with me on that? And again, just let me point down, then we'll do the rest of the chapter, right? The normal way it should say, and again, the beginning of verse 11, it should say, Vaya'al Shlomo at Bat Paro Me'ir David. That would be the usual grammar, but that's not what it says. It says, V'et Bat Paro He'ela Shlomo Me'ir David. Which again, it's not, and then Shlomo moved the daughter of Pharaoh from the city of David to a different house, but rather the daughter of Pharaoh, Shlomo, had moved from the city of David to a different house, okay? And that we've had that come up from different time. Let's continue in verse 12. Az he'eleh Shlomo olot la'Adonai al mizbach Adonai asher bana lifnei halum. At that time, Shlomo offered burnt offerings on the altar they had built in front of the porch, right? So we move the daughter of Pharaoh. We're going to build we're going to bring offerings in the altar and the porch, and we can do that because we sort of have this separation. This is still, even though it's a palace, it's a place of kedusha. Continuing verse 13, pasuk Gimel, uvidvar yom biyom la'alot k'mitzvat Moshe l'shabbatot v'chadoshim v'lamoedot shlosh pamim b'shana b'chag hamatzot v'chag hashvot v'chag hasukot. And not only then, but every day there were sacrifices according to what was told to us in the Torah, the commandment of Moshe, and there were special sacrifices on Shabbat and on Rosh Chodesh and on the 3 yearly pilgrimage festivals on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. We don't have it that often. We have explicit verses where we see people sort of citing the Torah, citing the book of Moshe later on in the Tanakh. Obviously, we have tons of that in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, where the laws are constructed, and we want to find the sources as to why we do X, Y, and Z. We have it back with Amatzia, not killing the children of the people who killed his father, because the Torah said a person should die for their sin. They shouldn't die for their sins of their parents. And here we see very specifically, we're told that Shlomo was bringing regular sacrifices on every day. We had a regular morning sacrifice, regular afternoon sacrifice, right? The korban shel shach, the korban shel bein harbaim, and special sacrifices on the holidays. Continuing verse 14, Vayamed k'mishpat David aviv et machlekot hakohanim al avodotam v'aleviim al mishmorotam lahalel u'lisharet neged hakohanim l'dvar yom biyomo v'hashoarim b'machlekotam l'shar v'shar kikein mitzvat David ish Elohim. And further, not only did he do that which Moshe had done, regular daily sacrifices and special sacrifices for the holidays, but following his father David, he set up the different divisions, different families of the priests and the Levites with their duties. Talked about 24 families of priests. Each presumably would work 2 weeks a year, plus the festivals, those 3 or so plus weeks a year. But they were different groups that were set up. Some would sing, and some would do different services, and some were gatekeepers, and some were watchmen. He set this up as his father had ordained. V'lo saru mitzvat hamelech al kohanim v'lavim l'chol davar villa utsarot. And he did not depart from the commandments of the king relating to the priests and the Levites and all these matters and all those relating to the treasuries, right? They had their jobs, they had their duties, and this is the way that the temple would run well. People had to know what the division of labor is, what they were supposed to do. It's very important, right? You have a structure, and that's something we talked about. So part of the difficulty of Shlomo is he, right, it basically enslaves for months at a time parts of the people. It makes things difficult for the Beit HaMikdash, but this is not the little Mishkan of Moshe. This is a big building project, and when you have a big building project, when you have a big government, when you have a big country, you need to have a structure in place or things do not function properly. And that is what Shlomo does here. To his credit, we think of bureaucracies and structures as things that can be very difficult, but oftentimes they're very necessary. Right, you can. It's one thing you have a little startup, but when your little startup all of a sudden has 5 million people are visiting your webpage every day, you're not a little startup anymore, and you need a structure to run your business and to run. And that's what Shlomo, in a sense, here is doing. Vatikon, verse 16, pasuk tetzayin, kom lachet Shlomo ad hayom musad beit Adonai ve'ad kaloto shalem beit Adonai. And all of Shlomo's work was well executed from the day the house of God was founded until the house of God was completed to perfection. It's telling us he was correct in doing this. As halach Shlomo le'etzion gever ve'el elot al sfat hayam be'eretz Edom. And at that time, Shlomo also went to Etzion Gever and to Elot and the seacoast, the land of Edom. Vayishlach lo churam biad avadav oniyot va'avadim yodei yam vayavo im avdei Shlomo ofira vaychu misham 450 kikar zahav vayaviu el hamelach Shlomo. And also at that time, Hiram, who we have these treaties with, sent him fleets of boats with expert seamen, and they went to Ophir, where they got lots of gold, 450 talents of gold, which were brought to King Shlomo. So this is parallel, like we said many times in these books. We'll just point out in a little time to the 9th chapter of the book of Melachim. The beginning of the 9th chapter of book of Melachim was actually some of the stuff we did in the last chapter, and a lot of it is similar. Shlomo gives, and that what's different there is Shlomo gives Hiram 20 towns Hiram doesn't like. Hiram provides Shlomo with gold. We're not told here about the Hiram not liking the town. Shlomo built some of the towns on the outskirts. We have the forced labor, but here it's different. The forced labor is only the foreigners, it's only the Gentiles. I shouldn't call them foreigners. There were people who were living in Israel before Yehoshua and the Jewish people came in, but non-Jews were given the foreign labor. Bnei Israel isn't. Pharaoh's daughter is mentioned here, but it's very different. It's not Pharaoh's daughter, the daughter of Pharaoh. Shlomo wants to be an empire like Paro, but rather how there's a separation. She has moved away from the Aron. We have similar here with the building of ships in Etzion Gever and the gold. But again, here the stress is much, much more about the temple service, about the Kohanim, and much less about his building projects. So Chronicles is sort of, Divrei Hayamim is polishing the picture of Shlomo, omitting political tension. Hiram is not happy with the cities. He thought they were bad places that Shlomo get in, focusing instead on the proper worship, the proper temple system. In Kings, it shows Shlomo's glory, but it also shows some of the warts and some of the difficulties. Here we leave out much of the warts. Here we're really talking about Shlomo at his best, Shlomo the builder of the temple, Shlomo who's bringing sacrifices like Moshe Rabbeinu, Shlomo who is following in the footsteps of his father as a great religious leader. And with that, we're trying to push and to charge, to challenge, to inspire the people at the Second Temple period. Look who you are following. You're following David, you're following Shlomo, you're following your little temple is following in the footsteps of their great temples that they had and what they stood for and the great wealth that they attained and the great lives that they led. And that is where we want. The Second Temple, the authors of Divrei Hayamim, is saying to the Jewish people with the slightly different version of history that they are presenting.